Welcome to another episode of The Evaluation Couch, the podcast where we talk about career growth and the field of evaluation. This is your host, Maria Montenegro. Hello, everyone. I'm very excited to have two guests with me today to help us discuss some resume myths and questions that we often have when we're trying to apply for evaluation jobs. I'm going to let them introduce themselves so you can get to know them before we start talking about myths and answering some questions that were shared in social media with us. So, Shelby, would you like to go first?
Sure. I'm Shelby Corley. I live in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, and I am a mom and a wife and a soccer player and an evaluator for most of my time.
That's awesome. Shelby, are you excited for 2026 and the World Cup in Canada?
Yes, I am very excited. We're on the list to get tickets, and I have no idea what they're going to cost or where we're going to go, but we're going to get to a game. I'm gonna put that out into the universe, and some tickets will find their way to me.
I love that. Thank you so much. And we also have Stephanie. Can you please introduce yourself?
Hi, yes, I'm Stephanie Moy, and I live in Westchester County, just above New York City. And I'm also a wife and a mom of two kids, including one of was a theater kid, so I spent a lot of time around theater, and also having been an evaluator for most of my career. And this spending time with scouts and kids and just whatever activities that lends itself to.
Amazing. So in this episode, we're going to be talking about our experiences in the table of hiring and seeing job applications for evaluations. Can we get started with each of us sharing what has been our experience in terms of hiring for evaluation roles in general? And also, if you've had recent experiences hiring for a role, have you experienced any challenges? What are you seeing? Are you seeing any trends in terms of the job market?
So many years ago now, I worked for a large health authority in their evaluation services department. And so within that role, I would hire more junior evaluators, lots of entry-level positions, and would get lots of applicants for those because it's a well-known organization where we live. And it's one of the few organizations that would actually have job titles that said evaluation in them. Many other evaluation jobs at that time, at least, were buried within other kinds of job titles. It's different for me now. I run a small evaluation consulting company. So we're about 11 people right now. We don't hire very often. So when we do, it has to be right. It takes so much effort on the part of applicants and on the part of the organization that's hiring to get someone in, to get them trained, to get them feeling comfortable and competent. So we take a lot of time to make sure that we get it right. So I probably can't comment a lot on trends because we don't hire that often. We haven't had someone quit our organization in a couple of years, 3 years, coming up to 4 probably. So we're only hiring when we're growing, which is slow and steady is what I feel comfortable with. But I do find that with the right sort of attention, with crafting the right job description, we do get a lot of really great candidates who are excited to get into the world of evaluation or continue their work in evaluation, just in a somewhat different kind of setting.
Yeah, and to piggyback off that, so I work in a nonprofit social service agency in New York City. The hiring that I tend to be involved in is for positions that we call program analyst that does the evaluation for various types of programs in social services, whether they're education, after school, foster care, programs like that. Some of our higher positions tend to be promoted within, but sometimes we do open that up. And we do end up going through a hiring process, probably 2 or 3 a year, due to turnover. Social services don't always have the strongest pay. That's determined by external forces. So we do end up going through a hiring process. And we've had some mixed responses to some of the job postings that get put out there, because program analyst is sometimes viewed as an entry-level position, but there needs to be some evaluation experience that comes in. We do get some mixed responses in that, like people who come in with heavy research background and maybe not necessarily evaluation background, and trying to figure out how to get the best fit for the organization. And also maybe there's some new things that could come in with that person.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for sharing that. And then I'm reflecting about my experience. So I have been in a manager role for about 3 years, also in public sector in British Columbia, Canada. And although it's been not as many years, I've had a parental leaves that have meant that I've had to hire a few positions related to evaluation, or that include both evaluation and research components in that one position. So those have been medium, mid, or senior level positions. And I was sharing with Shelby and Stephanie before we hopped on the recording that I've been finding it quite challenging to find applicants that are at that level. It's easier when we have entry-level positions and we get a lot of applicants, especially now that in post-secondary institutions, at least where we live, there seems to be more training and more awareness of the field in programs like Masters of Public Health and similar master's programs. So entry-level positions seem to be easier. But when we think about the medium and senior positions, yeah, it's been harder to find people that, as Stephanie said, have the evaluation background, knowledge, understanding of evaluation processes, and that actually meet that level of experience. So another thing I ask both of you to think about, if you can share, is what has been a kind of cringy or funny experience or memorable experience that you have had in a job application process?
Yeah, I was thinking about this, and I think the worst thing that I did, at least that I'm aware of, maybe I did something that no one ever told me about, but I used a reference who was my direct supervisor. It had been a little while since I worked there because I had been on a parental leave. But the mistake I made was that I didn't check in with her to say, are you available to do this reference? And would you give me a good reference? And so she was available and did give me a reference. I don't know how good it was because she called me after and said, I gave you a reference. It might not be great because I wasn't even your boss. And I said, you were, but yeah. So I don't know what it was that she said about me. I don't know if she said that she was not my boss, but it was one of these organizations where the org chart changes sometimes. And I was in sort of an evaluation role, sort of a bit more operational. And yeah, I guess this person wasn't quite aware that she was supervising me despite doing my performance review and that kind of thing. So that is definitely a lesson that I have shared, is just check with your references to make sure that they're going to give you a reference and that it will be a good reference.
That's interesting, Shelby, and you're making me reflect on that second question as well. Can you give me a good reference? I'm reflecting on recent times when people have asked me this question, and it's usually just, are you available to give me a reference?
Yeah. Yeah. And the assumption is, right, that you'll give me a good reference, but I think it's worth asking.
Yeah. And sometimes it's about what the reference is for, what type of job it's for. Like, I would give you a great reference for a specific type of position, or if I'm only asked about how you performed in the position that I supervised. But that doesn't necessarily mean you would recommend them for a specific position. What about you, Stephanie? Did anything come to your mind?
A lot of things came to my mind, but in thinking about the references, I was remembering when I first applied to where I am now, and that was 19 years ago, but I was actually transitioning from being a counselor in a youth organization to moving into what was then called the Quality Improvement Department. And I think back to the reference, like my supervisor was one of my references, but he supervised me as a counselor. And I didn't do any of the prep of, oh, by the way, I'm changing careers. I'm going into quality improvement. So talk more about the case record reviews that I've done and like where I've done data analysis on incidents and things like that. I didn't do any of that prep. What made that really cringy though was he was a very casual type of supervisor. So when he got the message to call the hiring manager to do my reference, he decided to make the call back sitting beside me at work. So he's doing this whole reference of me, and I'm like, I can't. And the space we were in, I can't even leave. Like, how do I? This is weird sitting next to my. Fortunately, it ended up he gave me a good reference. I don't know how much it related to evaluation, but it was such a weird experience for me.
Wow. I have never heard of someone giving a reference with the person sitting right next to them.
I don't recommend ever doing that. It's just such an uncomfortable experience.
That's a lot. Thank you for sharing that. The one that I was thinking about whenever I think about applying and like funny things, this one comes up. And when people ask me about preparing for interviews, but this one time I was in an interview that was for an evaluation related job. And they asked me a question that it was something like, if you were a part of a bicycle, what would you be and why? And it was such a funny question. And then when I tell this story, people are like, what did you answer? And I think that's the cringiest part. It's like what I answered because I was put on the spot. But what I answered was, I would be a bell because I think safety is important. I don't really think that answer says a lot about me. It's just like the first thing that came to my mind.
That is such a tough question.
Yeah,
it is. And it's something that comes up a lot because I know like where I work, they always start with a check-in question. When I get to choose the check-in question, it's something like, what's your favorite part of the holidays? Or something simple. What's your favorite food? But then there's been times where the question has been something like, what part of the car would you be? I'm like, I have no idea.
And it makes us, I think, as evaluators, what's the point of this question? What information are you getting out of it? And how does that inform your decision? And man, I don't have an answer for the bicycle one.
No, and I think more than that, I think some of these questions I like the idea of a check-in question to build rapport, but some of these questions can have the impact of kind of increasing your anxiety as being the person being interviewed. So I agree. Yeah, I think it's an interesting one. I'm not really sure what they were hoping to do with the question or how they rated my answer, but it's a memorable moment nonetheless. Okay, so what we're going to do for the next part of the episode is I'm going to share some kind of resume myth. That's what I'm calling them. But the reality is there's conflicting information out there about what a resume should be. Some of it is more guidance. Some is more directive. Like, you have to do this. And I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are, if you have any initial reactions around these kind of myths that are out there. And just feel free to share what comes to your mind, either from an experience you've had reviewing an application or just generally when you think about how you approach resume building or whatever comes to your mind. Are we ready?
Yeah.
Okay. I think this first one is going to be interesting. Consider we have someone from Canada and someone from the United States. But the first one is resume should be 1 page long.
I disagree with that. First of all, there's the whole discussions around 1 page. Does that mean one sheet of paper front and back, or is it just the front page? But the rule of thumb that I tend to go with is make it as long as necessary and as short as possible. There are some candidates out there who have a lot of experience, but it bridges multiple places. And it's really hard to get that nugget down to this little tiny paragraph or like bullet point. The resume needs to tell the story of the candidate. So that's why I prefer that rule of the as long as necessary, as short as possible. Sometimes it just won't fit. But also clean up the unnecessary stuff. I don't need to know your college job if you're like in your 30s, unless it's very relevant. So, or your high school. I've received resumes that had their high school. I was a clerk at the grocery store. I'm like, I don't need that. But figuring out like what's the important stuff that needs to be on the page.
Yeah. I don't care how long it is. I don't want it to be 5 pages, probably. I love that as long as necessary, as short as possible, because it depends on what's in there. If you've got a lot of relevant stuff, sure, I'll look at more of it. I don't need to see something that looks like the CV that you submit for grant funding.
I like that. I'm surprised about that, Stephanie. I had this story that in the US, it's 1 page or you're out kind of thing. But yeah, it's interesting to hear there's different views about that.
There's entirely a large population that probably says it has to be this 1 page. But, and maybe this is more towards evaluation and social services, but telling the story of the person and having a little more detail on the resume gives you a little more information about their position and their positionality when they're coming into the evaluation work they're going to do.
Yeah, I love that. Okay. The next one is a little bit related to what you both have mentioned around keeping it relevant, but there's some guidance out there that says that you should only include experience that is less than 10 years old. How do you feel about that?
Again, I'm not big on hard and fast rules. I think if you've got something that's older than that's like really interesting or relevant, or it matters to you that, this is something that you have held really close, you feel like you've taken good experiences from, sure, throw it in. If you were, in the Olympics 12 years ago, that's cool. I'd like to see that. But yeah, again, if it's not relevant, why include it?
Yeah, I would agree. If there's something that's more than 10 years old that's relevant, then that's should be there. Or if it's really like key to you, who you are and what you're bringing to the table, keep it in. But it really is more about what's relevant instead of that hard rule of this time period.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's very useful to know for people, especially in like mid positions. But I think the important takeaway is if it's something that adds to the story you're telling or to the relevancy of the position, then keep it in. Okay. The third one is you should start your resume with a career objective at the top.
I don't know that it needs to be a should. I would look to a cover letter to understand more about who are you and what are you after. I've certainly gotten a lot of resumes that have a career objective that says something like, I want to work at your organization. And that's nobody's career objective, right? That does not come across as genuine. If it is genuine and this is, I want to get my foot in the door in your organization and work my way up and I want to do this kind of work specifically. Again, I think if it's really relevant and on target, then that would matter to me. But if it's just a piece of your resume that hasn't been updated and isn't customized to the job that you're applying for, it would probably detract.
That's the important point, because I read a lot of resumes that had a very standard career objective or had the wrong job title in it. Like they had tailored it to something else they applied to. I'm like, yeah, that's not what we're hiring for. And that will be something like that's a lack of attention to detail. Actually, what I prefer instead of that, I want this, is more like that brief summary that you put on your LinkedIn. Like, I am an evaluator with such and such years of experience with a passion for youth voice in evaluation. Something brief like that would probably catch my attention more than I want a job at your organization.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think for a lot of the entry level positions too, I don't expect someone who's at that stage to necessarily know what their career objective is. I think at this point, maybe it's, I need a job and I want, I need to work somewhere. I need to start gaining some experience, but I don't know what that long-term vision is. And for me, that's okay. That's great. Maybe you should have all your options open to you.
I like that suggestion of treating it more kind of as your headline of one sentence, who are you? And less as a career objective that is a bit obvious, applying for getting this job if I'm applying for this job. That's usually where I stand as well. The next one, Shelby already hinted to the Olympics example, but you shouldn't include hobbies or interests. How do you feel about this?
I don't think I have a strong opinion either way on it. I will say that with the entry-level positions, I do get more of the hobbies and interests. If it seems like relevant, then definitely yes, include it. Because there are some hobbies and interests that would relate to the work that we're doing. But otherwise, I'm like, don't have a strong opinion. It does remind me, though, there was one time I was in an interview, and when we got to the questions for the candidate could ask us questions, the candidate asked me, "What's your hobby?" Like, I wasn't expecting that. So it just seemed like an odd conversation. Sometimes I'm not sure exactly how the hobbies and interests necessarily fit in.
Yeah, I wouldn't say they're necessary, but I really do like seeing them. I like to see who is your whole person. And not that I would necessarily hire, oh, you're a tennis player versus a quilter, so I'm going to hire the quilter. But I just think it adds a little bit of insight into who you are. And I guess I also just like to see that you are interested in things, because I think in our work, at least in my company, we're not limited to one sector, where we do work across basically anything that's in the social determinants of health. So seeing that people bring these like little niche interests, or they have these cool little aspects of their experience, I think you bring it with you to your job. So I think it's interesting to see, but probably not necessary. But I definitely enjoy reading them.
I like that different perspectives. And I think an important thing as well that I've noticed when looking at job postings is for some organizations, I think some organizations have like a culture or an interest, or for example, a leader that is very vocal about, like, we're more than evaluators in my company. We like to support different kind of interests of our staff. So I think it's also a bit about like tailoring, and that's a way that could show up. Okay. How do you feel about including GPAs in a resume in the education section? So like when they have their title and then GPA 3.8.
I don't think I've seen that very often. And I think, honestly, I would find it a little weird to include, because I'm not asking for a transcript. I want to know, what's your experience? What do you like doing? What are you good at? Where do you want to go?
I agree. I don't need to know what your grades were. You did well enough that you got the degree. Okay. But honestly, the one time I did see a GPA was for someone who was more than 5 years out of school. I'm like, why are you telling me this? It actually worked against them. I don't think you need to tell me this part. It's more about what you're bringing to the table than your GPA.
Yeah, I love that. You would be surprised by how many people, especially when they're like wrapping up their degrees, have this concern about, I have to show my GPA, I have to include it there. And then when it's not like a 4.0 or 3.9, I think it creates this anxiety. I think it's encouraging to hear how some people reading applications feel about that. Okay, and then the last one is resumes are read first, and then people decide whether to read the cover letter. How does that show up in your process?
I do the opposite. If I don't have a cover letter, I don't read the resume, because we ask for a cover letter. If you can't follow the instructions in our posting, then that's a big red flag. But I like to read the cover letter first, because I'm looking for specific things that we have asked for. But that's because that matters to our organization. And I know others are different, but to me, seeing the cover letter tells me about how you write. It tells me about how you synthesize ideas. It tells me about how concise you can be and how you can pinpoint what matters and how you can draw the alignment between you and what we're looking for.
So for me, I'm forced to read the resume first, and that's just because of the hiring software platform that our HR uses. The resume is right there, and then I have to go like several clicks in to get to the cover letter. If there's a cover letter, the cover letter is not always, people don't always submit a cover letter because of this online format. So I am forced to read the resume first, but I rely on that cover letter to give me what I'm missing. So even for a somewhat entry-level position, I'm looking at a resume. If I'm not seeing like the whole picture there, I want that cover letter, fill in the gaps for me so I can give you a chance. But a lot of people aren't doing that cover letter anymore. So I'm like, I'm going to have to reject this resume because I don't have enough information. I value the cover letter so much, though, so that when I applied to move from being a senior analyst to an assistant director, I included a cover letter, and the hiring manager was my supervisor. And I'm like, I still want to give a cover letter to tell you what I'm bringing to the table beyond just what my resume is. And she had been supervising me for 10 years. But it is an optional field.
In my organization, there's no field for cover letters. So I actually rarely see a cover letter anymore. And when I do see it, to be honest, I try not to read it because I think it's a bit unfair that people don't have the chance to upload their cover letter. So I just rely on resumes, but it's very challenging to get the full picture of a person. And especially when you have someone with different paths in their careers applying for a job and you're like, what are you trying to do? Did you read the job description? And maybe they did, but without that opportunity to tell you what they're after, it's very challenging from a resume to understand.
The one thing I would say, though, is for those platforms that the cover letter is optional, if you're going to put a cover letter in, please do the tailored cover letter to this position. I've had quite a few that had submitted a cover letter, but it's that stock, please consider me for this position, my resume is attached type cover letter. And that actually, why did you bother to submit this? You didn't have to.
Yeah. I'm always looking for the story of the person and why they want to work in evaluation. As you said, Stephanie, not research, evaluation. Why do you want to work here? And in our postings too, we ask people to describe their values and how they align with our values that are posted on our website. So it's that extra little bit of putting together a compelling argument for yourself, which is what you're going to have to do in this job also. So to me, it's just more evidence that you can do the work that we're looking for, more so even than a resume at times.
Shelby, one question I have around including that instruction to align with values, because that's rarely an instruction given by organizations, but that is something that I, for example, recommend people do if it's a very values-based organization. Do you find that candidates are often make a compelling case, or does it seem more like Stephanie was sharing kind of a blank statement of, I share this value, but they're not really demonstrating how or convincing you that they actually do align with the value?
Yeah, the ones that we hire do convince us, and the ones that don't get hired, because that's one of the things we ask is, what stands out and why does that speak to you and what is compelling about it? And so we do get good applications where we can see that folks have gone and looked at what those values are and thought about how they're operationalized and thought about which ones speak to them. And it's very intentional for us. We're a small business and we hire and review and fire based on our values. And so that's a big part of having a healthy organization for us.
I love that. That's very interesting. Okay. So I have a few questions that people have shared that I'm interested in getting your opinion on. The first question is, how should I organize my information in my resume? And I think this question is going a little bit deeper around the sections in a resume. Are there specific preferences in terms of what comes first? What is your opinion on that?
I would say your experience is first, as well as your skill set. So there's a lot of resumes will have a section like, I am proficient with SPSS, Microsoft Office, what if you have that skill set or leadership or whatever, having that skill set identified and experience that relates to the position you're applying for, like really highlighting what that experience is. Using myself as an example, before I came into the evaluation work, I was a counselor, but I tailored the resume to say, yes, I did counseling, but I also, in that role, I was doing case record review to ensure that quality records. I was doing database management around incident reports. So I highlighted the stuff that related to the job I was applying to instead of leaving that stock. Here's everything I did in that job. And education is put that towards the end. One note about education, though, is so the agency I work for is establishing anti-racist practices. So the school you went to is actually blurred out when I see your resume.
Interesting.
Those are things to keep in mind, that depending on what the agency or organization or whatever, what they're hiring, I might not even see what school you go to.
And what does that, in a US context, what does the school tell you? What's the kind of unconscious bias that you're trying to get rid of, or very conscious bias that you're trying to avoid in that?
Some schools have weight just because of their name. Oh, you went to Harvard, as opposed to the local state school or community college or whatever that is. So like eliminating that bias around the name of the school.
And maybe Canada's a little bit different because we have so fewer schools that maybe that's not as relevant. Interesting idea, though, because I certainly look for the education first. Not so much the school, but the program. We generally, for the most part, only hire people with a graduate degree. That's one of my quick checkmark things that I'm looking for. So I probably look for the education first and then the experience. If it was in a different order on a resume, I'm pretty smart. I'll probably find it anyway.
Yeah, especially if you're looking for it and it's something that you need to see and check. Stephanie, I'm so curious about the blurred information, and that actually relates to another question that we got around what are some unconscious biases that come into play in the hiring process, and what are some of the strategies that you put in place to mitigate those. And the blurring of information is one of them, Stephanie. But I'm curious, is there other information in the resume that is blurred for the purpose of reducing biases?
I believe age is blurred. When I get the application, I don't know the race. It is captured by HR because we want to make sure we get a wide pool.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't necessarily, when I get it, I don't necessarily see race.
Do you see names?
Yes, I do see names. Otherwise, it'd be very confusing.
Interesting. Yeah, that's very interesting. So what are some biases that you think still might occur? Are there other strategies that are in place or that you put in place when you're reviewing applications?
The agency I work at, we do panel interviews. So as a hiring manager, I'm not necessarily in the first panel. I will screen resumes and, create a pool. HR will do some screening and make sure that the candidates are eligible for the job and clarify some key things. But the first panel, when they get sent the resumes, they don't have name. They see candidate A, B, C, or D until they get into the panel and do introductions. So that is one thing. But one of the biggest ways we do try to eliminate bias is we do have those panel interviews, and every candidate is asked the same questions, which sometimes is frustrating because it limits your follow-up questions when you want to know more. But every candidate is getting the same question. It's asked by the same person each time. And then everyone that's on the panel, they have a scoring rubric. We've all pre-identified what counts, what each of the scores would be included in each of the scores. So that way everyone is using the same rubric. And then candidates are moved on to the next round based on how they did in that panel. But there's always at least someone else in the interview with you to help counteract any biases that you might have.
Yeah. What about you, Shelby?
We definitely don't have that much process around anything. We don't have an HR department. We don't have any application portal. We don't have any of those tools that are helpful in putting in some systems to help make sure that bias is mitigated as much as possible. So we probably are much more exposed to bias, or we could call it subjectivity as well, because I think that when I'm hiring someone, I can't be fully objective and I can't say your experience is an 8 and yours is a 7. To me, there's just so much more nuance to it. It's just not a fit for me and how I approach work to bring that much structure into it, which probably does introduce the risk of hiring yourself or someone who looks like you. We do also have multiple folks on the interview, and we do talk to each other about what are those biases that you're always looking at. You know, I'm Indigenous. If I see an Indigenous applicant, that's going to count for a little bit more for me. And I'm okay with that. That's fine by me. But yeah, so I try personally to not give someone with an anthropology degree, which is what I have, more weight than someone with a public health degree or a biocide degree or something like that. That it needs to come down to more of those interview questions, the information that comes out through those. But I will also, no one's going to get mad at me for running off on a tangent in an interview. I will sometimes ask some questions that are more relevant for one applicant than another, or because it's, to me, an interview is a conversation, and I'm not a conversation robot. So we run into tangents and that kind of thing. And maybe it's not entirely fair. Those same questions wouldn't be relevant to another person.
That's an interesting reflection, and that idea of what is fair, what is less biased. Coming in as a new manager in my role, making the process less biased was very important for me. And I spent quite a lot of time researching how to reduce biases in hiring processes. And I have changed the way that I do hiring in my team from a result of that. But one of the things that I found is that there's no consensus on this is the one way of making the process less biased, even in terms of having the same question for all candidates versus having it be more conversational. There's arguments for both. My takeaway is choosing something that feels right for you and then keeping those conversations going in terms of, okay, where can bias be introduced, and including other people in that decision making and those discussions to reduce the risk. What I have in place, similar to what Stephanie, in terms of including different people in the panel. We're a small team, so I am involved in usually those interviews. And the rubrics has been something that has really helped, in my opinion, because when I started changing our process, I started having conversations with the other interviewers and being like, okay, why did you rate this person a 3 versus a 5 in this question? And the answers were like all over the place. So these rubrics describing this is what a 5 answer could look like versus a 1 answer, I think has reduced that discrepancy between people's interpretations of interview answers. But similar to Shelby, the other thing that I try to do and encourage in my team is staying away from scoring interview questions and more towards scoring skills. And that will mean that sometimes the person comes in and isn't the best interviewer, or they're nervous. Something just happened in their life and they're a bit all over the place, and their answer to one specific question isn't going to be perfect. But what we're after is, do they have the skill we're trying to assess? So we might have follow-up questions. We might clarify the question, and it's changed the way in which we make decisions, because the reality is not everyone's good at interviewing, but that doesn't make them not a good candidate for the position. What I wanted to highlight with this episode is that there's different ways in which organizations operate and make these decisions. So sometimes reading a suggestion or a guide that is very black and white is just not going to apply everywhere. So it's important to keep that in mind. Okay, and maybe near towards the end, what do you find is the most challenging skill or experience for evaluation job applicants to communicate in their application?
I think throughout, I am looking for evaluative thinking and that kind of like critical thinking that we need, right? Because you can be really great at stats, but I need you to think about the stats too. And I think you can write evaluative thinking on your list of skills, but it's hard to convey. How do you do that? And that's one of the reasons why I like the cover letter, because I think it does give a bit of view into how do you put together all these pieces of information to come to a conclusion. And it's a conclusion about yourself, but it's still, I think that's the best piece of evidence that I've discovered so far.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree. It's the evaluative thinking is hard to convey. The other piece, like for me, where I work, it's internal evaluation. And it's great if you really need to know your numbers and stuff, but you also need to be able to talk about those numbers with people who are not evaluators. So being able to explain your evaluation to people who don't like evaluation. There will be program people who will think that you're telling me whether I'm doing a bad job or not. And that's not what program evaluation is. So being able to communicate that skill, like, no, this is how we're going to help make your program better. Here's how we're going to highlight your strengths. Here's how we're going to work around any challenges that are coming up. And being able to apply that evaluation to program decision making. And that is a hard thing to capture in the resume and evaluate and the interview process, is how well you do with that step.
And both, as you say and recognize, it's challenging to communicate that, especially when you think about the resume in just like a one sentence. When I reflect about what I like to see in job applications, but it's very challenging to communicate effectively in such a short piece of paper. But it's a bit more about the approach. I think every different evaluators will have different approach to work. And something that is important when I'm reviewing applications is that their approach is actually going to match our culture and our being internal evaluators as well. There are those dynamics that we have to play in. We have to convince people about the value of evaluation. We have to reframe their thinking about evaluation. We have to also make sure that our evaluations are used. So those aspects of how an evaluation is conducted can be quite different in another setting. So communicating that you have either the experience or at least that understanding that evaluation approaches can look differently in different settings, that's something that I look for, but find it hard to find in a piece of paper. Great. That has been very informative. Thank you so much, both of you. Before we close off, could each of you share an advice for people that are in their process of applying for jobs in evaluation?
I think it's important to choose the organization that you want to work with based on something other than they have a job available. And I know that's a privilege to have, right? You can't always choose the best place to work. Sometimes you just have to choose a place to work. But when you have the option to be selective and be intentional about where you're applying to, I think that helps you get that job, right? If you can understand, why do you want to work as an internal evaluator at an agency? Why do you want to work as an external evaluation person at a consultancy? I think that helps you write a better application and just leads you to a better place in your job. And maybe it's actually one that you're happy with.
Yeah, I would agree. My advice would be similar to that, is thinking through what is it that you would like to be able to get out of the evaluation yourself and what you're bringing to it. And just understanding how your approach would affect the evaluation. I think a lot about positionality. If you're someone who is very passionate about youth voice, then go for an evaluation work that would be working with youth. It's finding the right organization and the right fit for what you want to do. Again, I recognize, that is a position of privilege to be able to be selective. But when you have that opportunity to take that opportunity to really think through, what do you want to be doing with it? What are your priorities? What agencies and organizations align with what's important to you?
Yeah, thank you so much. What I'm taking away is the importance of when there's that alignment and there's that intentionality around why you want to be in that specific organization, things will flow easier. When you're writing your cover letter, when you're writing your resume, that story that you tell, it's going to flow more naturally. And then, as Shelby said, ultimately, if you end up getting that position there, then it's going to be a better fit.